discussion focusing on water reuse, wastewater recovery. And I hope some of you have some already participated in some of the discussions and have some background information. I will endeavour to give a brief summary of why we're here and what we're aiming to focus on. My name is Jonathan Parkinson, and I work for the International Water Association. The area in which I focus my activities on is urban sanitation and wastewater management. And IWA was pleased to participate and collaborate with the UN Water Wastewater Task Force to discuss this issue of wastewater management. As I hope some of you are aware, the purpose of the consultation is to look at different aspects of water management in light of the post-2015 development goals. The main focus on MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, which are coming to an end quite soon, has been primarily on household water, from a WASH perspective, on the household water, access to water, and access to sanitation. In this, the next era of the development goals, we'll be looking more broadly across different aspects of water management. And at the moment, we have three parallel but interlinked streams of discussion, one of which is a continuation of WASH, which is looking at WASH and how that interconnects with other aspects of the water and waste management cycle, and also issues related to access. We have one related to water resource management, which I think is self-explanatory, which is looking at the wider management issues of water resources in the bigger picture. And this current stream, which we're focusing on, which is on wastewater management and water reuse. So as we have an hour to talk about this, I don't want to talk for too long. So I will now introduce the other participants, who I hope you can see on the screen. I will just introduce Job, who's on the left, but unfortunately you can't see him on your video. This is Job Kramwinkel from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And I will just come to you in a minute, panel, just to introduce yourselves. Second from the left, we have Valentina Lazarova, who is from Suez Environment, and she's also chair of the IWA Specialist Group on Water Reuse. Next to Valentina, in the middle, is Graham Alabaster from UN Habitat. UN Habitat and Aquafed are the two leading organisations with the on this wastewater stream. And then Javier Mateo Sagastia Davila from FAO, Land and Water Division. And I believe that you'll be speaking from us from Rome, is that correct?
Right. Yeah.
Graham, you're currently in Geneva, I believe. Valentina, you'll be in Paris, is that correct? And Job, where will you be speaking from? Job, you're from Holland. Or Geneva as well. Okay. So with that brief introduction, I'll just give a quick, very brief summary of where we are, and then I'll turn to the panelists. We started this process a couple of months ago, really at the tail end of last year, beginning of this year. And we've had some meetings. There has been some circulated minutes from a meeting which we had at the end of last year. And we've been moving towards this consultation, which we are currently in the process of now. And I believe that there has been some extension on the consultation process, which I believe is very welcome, giving more people a chance to participate and air their views. And we are moving towards a meeting in Geneva, which will be a combination of the water resource management and wastewater management themes. That's the end of this month. And then what will go forward to a high level, more of a political meeting in The Hague in March, will be the recommendations from this consultation process. Now I'd like to turn to the panelists, and I'd just like them to introduce themselves, briefly present their interest in this issue of wastewater management, water reuse, and just give us a quick perspective from your organisational background. What would be your specific interest in this discussion? If I could start from in the order that I introduced you, Job, please could you go first?
No, first, apologies. You can hear me clear?
We can hear you loud and clear, Job. Yes.
Good. Sorry for the lack of the video, but that's technology nowadays. Yes, I'm Job Kamik. I'm the Director of Water of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, bringing together water users and significant water users like the energy and food sector, but also solution providers. And in that context, we are very interested, of course, in the whole UN consultation process for water, but specifically on this one about water reuse, water quality. And that's because we see in the business community, of course, that access to water is going to be difficult for all. So there will be an allocation issue, and you can do that by being more water efficient, but also by generating more resources, and water reuse is one of them. When we looked at that, we really see that this is still something in its infancy. Certainly, there are some of course good examples where we see that that water from water treatment facilities being used for industrial water, but we'd like to see a lot more of that. Apart from the fact that we see that some of the valuable resources like nitrogen and phosphorus are being wasted in throwing this into the aquatic systems, and therefore doing significant damage. We see a great opportunity there as well. So really my interest here is to get these indicators to drive significant uptake of water reuse and recovery of essential elements in the wastewater, so that we actually can, do two things, be more efficient with our water resources and protect the water resources itself. So really keenly interested in getting indicators which really drive action on the ground, and really helpful to be part of this debate.
Thank you very much, Job. Valentina, could you introduce yourself and just give us a quick perspective?
Well, Valentina Lazarova, I'm from Suez Environment. I'm firstly here as chair of the IWA Water Specialist Group. Well, we have 2,000 members from all over the world, more than almost 100 countries, and our mission is to help the development of water use practices of safe water use practices and developing country. So really, during the last years, we have a very active collaboration with IWA and with IOP, with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, to disseminate the good practices for water use, from one sector for another, how we can help to recover nutrients, clean water, of course, as alternate resource, but also how we can recover nitrogen in, of course, now phosphorus. But another very important issue, we worked on this and we published a book, is to recover also and to valorize the energy embodied in wastewater. So my background is process engineer. I have a PhD in habilitation for direct research in France, which is the state PhD, high level. I have a very good knowledge in wastewater treatment and design, both advanced technologies and low-tech technology for the countries. And within Suez Environment, I was lucky to work on water use project also in many developing countries such as Bolivia, Morocco, Algeria, and China. So really the topic is very important. I am very excited because I was in the lobbying group for the world forums to convince the decision makers that when we provide water supply, sanitation is very important, because we know a lot of cases in Africa when we implemented water supply without appropriate sanitation, the contamination of natural water resources and the diseases was higher than before to implement the water supply. So it's very important to implement in the same time good practices for water supply, sanitation, and of course, as Job underlined, for water reuse. This is very important for rural area, even in developed country, because rural area have not enough investment and the possibility to implement very expensive technology. And also, of course, for developing country where the water reuse is almost prerequisite for food safety. So I'm very lucky to be with you because we collaborated in the past with FAO, with Aquastat to develop, good practices for irrigation. We published a book with collaboration with FAO, and of course with WaCaFed, I'm sometimes advisor for the projects you have for funding. So really the topic is very important, and I hope that we will be able to formulate something easy to understand and to convince the politicians. Thank you. It's okay, you heard me? Oh. Yeah.
Okay, I'll go ahead then. Yes, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Graham Alabaster. I'm from UN Habitat, which is the agency within the UN system responsible for urban areas and urban development. I'm a public health engineer with many years of experience, particularly on wastewater in the developing world. And I'm currently on loan to the World Health Organization, where one of the topics of my work is going to be looking at wastewater reuse and the like. We're very interested from Habitat's perspective in wastewater reuse because of its essential contribution in the management and development of cities. As I'm sure many of you know, the world is rapidly urbanizing, and over the next couple of decades, it's going to become the critical development issue. As areas urbanize, of course, they will produce wastewater, not just from domestic sources, but from agriculture and industry. And the way we manage that wastewater and what we do with it will be critical, one of the most critical issues to urban development. I think in the past, there's been a sort of reluctance to understand the key role wastewater can play, but can offer as a group something useful, and people can begin to appreciate the importance and value of wastewater. So we're interested in the principally the urban development context and how in cities the water cycle based at the city and the level of urban can be managed more effectively to use resources. I'll stop there.
Okay.
Then is my turn, right?
Yes.
Go for it, Xavier.
Go ahead, Xavier.
Hi, good afternoon to everyone. I am Javier Matias Agasta. I work at the FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, and I am specialized in water quality, being my two fields of work, basically agriculture as a polluter, how to control water pollution from agriculture, and on the other hand, how to make a safe and more productive use of wastewater in agriculture, because the agricultural sector probably will need to be adapted to water quality that is being worsened. Because we need to consider that right now millions of tons of very valuable resources, water, nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, organic matter and others, are just lost, they are just wasted in the form of wastewater, causing important problems of pollution in water bodies, in seas, lakes, rivers. So for us, it makes a lot of sense to recover these valuable resources, this water, these nutrients from wastewater, to use them in productive activities such as agriculture to increase agricultural productivity and be able to feed the world. So that's why we are interested in this topic, and we are interested in the formulation of these specific targets and indicators that will allow us to set a goal and try to monitor our progress to achieve this goal, this target.
What do you think are the most useful technologies for water reuse in the future?
Well, it's very complicated questions because it depends on what condition, for what kind of application. So it is a complex issue because water use is good, but it's a local solution. So we at IWA, we published recently, just a few weeks ago, a book, 9 Milestones in Water Reuse, the best success stories. Of course, here we present a project for different kinds of application, agriculture, industry, environment enhancement, and so on, for urban habitat, because also urban reuse is very important, but all will depend for what country and what will be the scale. Our next reuse conference will be held in Windhoek at the end of October. And here, especially for developing country, into how to achieve the Millennium Goal for rural area, we will present several very successful stories in South Africa, and we have a special workshop organized on this, and there will be a lot of discussion, and probably if we have money and time, we will organize a visit. So always depends. What is very important to convince the politicians that when they develop their master plan for water supply, they have to include sanitation, water supply, of course, sanitation, and when they spend money for sanitation, it's normal to take into account the reuse, because even in developed country, even here in Northern Europe, when we spend so much money to recover stormwater, to recover and to treat wastewater, with a small amount of investment, we can use water for different beneficial uses. So water reuse, for my point of view, and for the point of view of the specialist group, should be included in the water portfolios in different stages in all the countries. And I think that this is important element for the Millennium Goal, because I remember before Johannesburg, nobody talked about sanitation. They said sanitation is not the priority. We need to provide the supply, but when they had some unsuccessful stories with the water supply, so now everybody, no, the majority of the experts are convinced that sanitation is important, but the politicians, they cannot understand because this issue is complex. So I think that our main task is to explain this.
If I may add something?
Yes, of course.
Yeah. I think that the key word also to assess whether or not the technology is suitable is cost effectiveness. So it needs to be effective to get the quality of the water that we need, but it also needs to be cheap if we're talking to implement this technology in developing countries. Meaning that in the end, what we need to pay attention is to the capacity to pay of the communities that are going to be using this technology. So it is very important to think also that if we want these potential technologies on water reuse to be widespread, probably the reclamation technologies, water reclamation technologies that have been successful in developed countries, in rich countries, probably are not going to be successful in developing countries because of the high cost of operation and maintenance, or the high energy cost involved. But there are low-cost technologies that can be implemented successfully in combination with irrigation practices and so on to gain in the end safe products. I think there is a good compendium, but we need to adapt these technologies to the context.
Great. Okay.
Robert, just let me intervene a little bit on the thing about technology choice. I think you've got to really go back to appreciate, I think, as the previous two, our previous two guests have said, that, you know, you really have to look at the local situation to decide exactly on the best approach for technology, because we see so many cases around the world where, you know, ideas imported from the developed world are shoehorned into the developing world, and they just don't work. So, you know, for example, it's completely inappropriate to take an activated sludge plant and then put it into a developing country and think it's going to produce an effluent which is suitable for agricultural reuse, because it was never designed to do that in the first place. So the whole idea is that we need to look selectively at each of the different situations. We need to design a treatment strategy for wastewater around its final use, bearing in mind that, you know, it depends on what we want to irrigate. It depends on whether we want to reuse the wastewater in industry. It depends on whether we want to use it for recharge of aquifers, and not be dictated to about any preconceived ideas. So for me, I think it's very important to look at the local situation. We've been doing some interesting work in UN Habitat, looking at as urban areas grow, how you can decentralize wastewater treatment. And, you know, there's a whole range of options available to us to provide the best tailor-made idea for whichever particular situation. I'll stop there, seeing as I see that Jonathan's now rejoined us.
Yeah, Graham and Javier, I fully agree with you, but it's local solution and depend on the scale, because yes, we have low-tech technology that don't need a lot of operation costs, but, you know, we will always need some pumps, you know, some operations, so we need to train, we need the capacity building, so even for water supply. So we have the solutions, but we need to adapt to local situation. I think that this shall be like, final conclusion for this discussion, as Graham and you underlining this.
Just about, yeah.
Only just about. I will shout. It raises a question which comes up in some of the submissions to the consultation to date. One of which raises the question: is it actually feasible to have an international target which has that relevance that you're raising at the local level? So there's a dichotomy, isn't there, like, of having a international standard which can then be appropriate at a local level. So how can we tackle that, and how can we formulate a target and indicators which have such wide-ranging application in such a diversity of contexts? How do you envisage that we can breach this?
Can I give this a try? Because I think that this is for water very. I think it's almost universal. I mean, it's a global issue, but it plays out locally very different. So I mean, any sort of hard target, global hard target, I personally think has to be sort of underpinned with a story which tells actually where the emphasis of the water reuse of the target, where it is applicable. So I fully sort of understand that the global target will be very difficult, at least to drive action on the ground. Without it, you don't get the signal that this is an extremely important issue. When we looked at industrial wastewater reuse, and when we try to get some data on what is actually being done, and it's very difficult to find out anything. So yes, a hard target is difficult, but I think the signal must be very clear that this has a huge potential, has to be measured, and that hard targets have to be developed. And if we today might agree that that is not the case, at least we have driven in the next couple of years a significant improvement of the issue and the potential for improvement. That is irrespective. That's on the volume base. That's not about solving quality issues, which I think are very universal, like all wastewater has to be treated, like nitrogen and phosphorus has to be recovered from the wastewater streams, and or wastewater facilities have to be energy, net positive, meaning that you have to take the energy out of the waste stream and use it. So some of those issues, quality issues, I think can be universal. The volume bit, I think in the next couple of years, driving very hard and then getting sort of in the target, which is underpinned with some regional targets or some sector targets or some national targets where we can actually build up from the bottom overall target, is probably something I would like to see.
Thank you very much. Would anyone else like to come in at that point?
I would like to add, we have two major risks in water use: public health protection and crops, negative impacts on crops. So the first issue, we have now very good WHO guidelines published in 2007 that are based on really assessment of health risks. So it's excellent basis for water reuse project and can be applied in all the country and all scales. So if we implement and follow WHO 2006 guidelines, it's perfect. Now we have USEPA, United States EPA, the new regulation in 2012. They also developed a special part because they had collaboration with US IAED in trying also to the transfer good practices for developing country. Concerning the negative impacts on crops, FIO published a very good papers on how we can manage salinity, how we can manage nutrients. So we have good practices. So if the question is how we can elaborate a standard, I think will be difficult. I'm working in a new group now, ISO, to write international standards on water use for irrigation, and the leading country is Israel. But the problem is that what they propose is not applicable to all the countries, and in particular for developing countries. So we need to be very careful with this, and well, we can also substitute us for the health organization. WHO now, the guidelines a good basis for development water use project, for me. And for us, for water use group, for IWA.
Thank you very much. Javier, would you like to comment on that, particularly in relation to, I suppose, this issue of the need for the targets to send out a strong political signal, but also have some sort of traction on the ground in terms of operations, in terms of practice, or do we accept that the target will be to some extent unsatisfactory from many practitioners' point of view, because it won't tackle the levels of detail? And this is something we see with the current discussions about the MDGs. After 10 years, there's a lot of pros and cons. We're now in a position to be able to sort of develop those further and to say, well, the MDGs on the wash side can encompass a more, I suppose, sophisticated approach. So, Javier, I'd just like to ask you whether you think that the target, we just have to accept that it won't be totally satisfactory, and we have to go for something kind of fairly crude in a way from a technician perspective, but effective from a political message.
Right. I do agree that it needs to be effective to provide a clear message, a clear political message, but at the same time it needs to be measurable, and it needs to make sense for the people in the field. Mm-hmm. So, well, the debate also was on whether to establish a global target that makes sense everywhere, or we should establish a more flexible or different targets for different regions, because probably water reuse makes more sense in water scarce or water stressed areas. So we need to pay attention and to try to make this target inclusive, trying to bring all the different settings where wastewater reuse could make sense, and cover all these settings within the target. It's not easy. There have been some propositions. For instance, if we consider that wastewater is going to be treated more and more, then once it is treated, and we may try to think about reusing it, since there has been a lot of investment already in getting some improvement in terms of quality. We can think then that this water needs to be reused for productive activities. But then what happened with all this untreated wastewater that is right now being used, and that will be still used in the future, because probably the wastewater treatment coverage won't be at the same rate that what we want and need. So it is very difficult to try to set these targets, an international target that suits everybody's or let's say or local situations. But we need to try to cover all these localities when defining the target.
We've had some discussions about whether a target would be more relevant framed in terms of process, which would enable different countries to be able to, in a sense, apply that within their own context, and develop a framework for indicators and monitoring that is appropriate to their specific location. What do the panelists think about having a target that was more directed towards process rather than a particular outcome? Graham, could I direct that to you, please?
Yeah, I think actually it's very important. I mean, I think the first issue about these process targets is we need to borrow something from the other groups in the idea of progressive realization, because we must accept the fact that pushing people towards a better use of wastewater is what we're after. We're not after to put punitive targets in place which are going to start to penalise people. So I'm very much in favour of, yes, embracing the concept of progressive realisation, looking at process, and providing targets which are going to provide an incentive for people to use wastewater more effectively, but also use less fresh water more effectively, and generally contribute to the overall efficiency cycle. So I would be very much in support of process-related targets, rather than a fixed percentage that should be treated or collected or whatever you want to put. I think it's not the way to go.
Okay, that's interesting. Thank you, Graham. Could I go back to you, Job, on that one? I'd like to hear from each of you on this particular point, please. Job, could you respond to that question? Are you there? Valentin. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I like that idea of progressive realization. Ultimately, it's true what we want is to be more effective with our water resources. And really, I think what we want is to drive the action and not necessarily see this as an exercise of numbers and compliance, because it necessarily drives the human action. But from the sector I'm coming from, they like numbers, they like clarity, they like the drivers to be related to their business. So I mean, we have to be careful that if we go to more process-oriented targets, that they have to be clear, that they have to drive the action and not necessarily lead to the process. So I think we're not there yet. I have to think a little bit about that, but ultimately I see some barriers which I like to see somehow reflected in our thinking. One is that this whole discussion about water reuse is very often driven by the value of water and the economics of it. The economics are not necessarily good. So we have to recognize that and perhaps define other drivers which are involved. And the second is that, and I looked a little bit at the statistics from Aquas, etc. This is not necessarily an issue of only municipal wastewater treatment units. There are industrial sectors which use a hell of a lot of water and are not necessarily part of the municipal water system. And I really think we should embrace those sectors to be part of the debate. So I would be very hesitant to see this really being a municipal wastewater reuse type of target. It should embrace industrial, and perhaps even given the first question we tried to answer, in the broader sense, water reuse is what the agriculture sector can do about it. So, and I know I broadened the discussion, but I think that's important because we shouldn't lose sight of the ultimate goal, which is basically two things: that we should have water for everything, and we shouldn't pollute the waters with our activities as well. So I mean, that's how I see it. And coming back on, so yeah, let's continue the debate and see what best drives the action.
Okay, thank you very much, Job. Certainly, so we've raised some pros and cons here of those arguments in relation to a process-orientated target, but also some reservations there about whether that would be satisfactory from some quarters in relation to having some more specific, more defined targets to actually achieve. I would like to. We have some questions which have come in, and in the time remaining, I'd like to turn to some of these. Some of these relate to incentives, so I'm going to sort of categorize some of these questions rather than going through them individually. There are two categories. One relates to incentives, this is all very well having targets, but there still needs to be the incentive for doing it in the first place. So how do we incentivize good practice to make sure that we achieve these targets however we frame them, because we all know, sort of broadly speaking, what we're the direction we're going for. We need to define more explicitly what that target is, but it's pretty clear what I think there's consensus among the panel here about what we're aiming for, and there was consensus with previous contributions to the group. So the question is about incentives. And then another key one, which is about, do we actually need to develop new approaches, technologies, or are we actually there in terms of technological development? Is it just a case of upscaling what we've got, or do we need to develop more approaches? So could I come back to the panel there and ask for your responses in relation to that? I think if we could turn to Valentina first, please, and then Javier. Thank you.
Okay, I start with the second questions. We have enough technologies. Of course, we have innovation, but we have a very broad choice of technology that can be applicable for all conditions. And though we need also to remember that water use is not only important for rich countries for the desert, but also for urban cities, because now one very important trend is the urban development. Probably Graham know very well, but for example, this decentralized wastewater treatment with recovering resources, energy. We have a very good example in Vietnam. You know, Peter Corner developed it, and in our IW book we described how it's possible to do. Of course, so to implement these technologies, you know, these best practices, of course, we need to have a framework of good management, incentive, and such kind of national policy for this. For water use, I think the governmental, institutional, and financial incentives are very important. So I agree, Xavier say that, well, In the past, we had a lot of very poor examples when we implemented water supply for developing countries and sanitation, and after that, nobody was able to support the operation cost. And for this reason, now the World Bank is looking to find a new innovative contracts and to have public-private partnership to be able to guarantee operation and to have enough time for capacity building. For example, we have good examples in Morocco, in Algeria, to implement good projects with advanced treatment. So all this depends if we have good incentives, if we have political support, national policy, both to be able really to implement and to operate this project, because it's complicated. And I underlined, we need not only low-tech technology for rural areas, but a big problem is now mega cities, how we can implement this and for the future on dense area, urban cities, where a lot of persons have not good water supply, sanitation, and water use in this case can be also a very valuable solution.
Thank you very much, Valentina. I won't go through in detail, but it's interesting you raised the issue of capacity building. There's a substantial contribution on the internet from the Susanna Working Group on this particular point. I would like to, offline, I would like to draw participants and panel's attention to that, and also perhaps we can follow up on that particular line afterwards. Javier, I said I would come to you next, so could I turn to you on this issue of either incentives or technical development, or both, if you have time to briefly summarize both.
Thanks. I can start with the one of new technologies versus upscaling existing technologies. So I would say that the problem is basically how to upscale what we do have. There has been a lot of investment in wastewater treatment plants that have been constructed but didn't work in the sense that they were not operated and maintained. Sure. Millions and millions of dollars invested in wastewater treatment plants that failed. So we need to identify why these wastewater treatment plants failed and try to overcome the barriers that these wastewater treatment plants had to be operated and maintained properly, and try to replicate the lessons learned out of this analysis. No? So yes, so in the end, it's more a matter of analyzing well what were the failure stories and try to avoid them, so that we can replicate or upscale the good technologies and the good approaches were needed.
That's a very good point.
And the other thing is the one on incentives, right? So incentives, I understand that incentives for a safe wastewater reuse, for a safe reuse, no? So probably what do people need to know? People need to be aware that there are health risks associated to wastewater irrigation, to untreated wastewater irrigation, so that they have the incentive to move for a safer practice. Right. On the other hand, they may need economic incentives because moving for a safer practice has a cost, and then they need to somehow recover this cost. If we are talking about wastewater treatment, we need to have a well-established cost recovery strategy to be able to get the money to cover the cost of operation and maintenance. And this needs to be there, no? This financial strategy needs to be there. And then by combining these economic incentives and social incentives, this awareness raising, we could have a better impact, I guess.
Thank you very much for that comment. In the last 5 minutes, I'd just like to think about move our attention a little bit to the discussion about, if we are going to have a more of a quantitative approach, which would it be better to look at volumes or loads? I think there's arguments in both directions. I just wanted to hear your feelings about whether it's more appropriate to look at volumes, which I think is clearly more focused on the water reuse side. But my own perspective of that is the danger is that it wouldn't encapsulate the need for the target to encourage resource recovery around nutrients and about energy. If we're only focusing on water volumes, and a very important point raised by Pei Drechtel from IMWI in the consultation was the fact that those countries which are in effect more arid have greater capacity to be able to actually meet the targets than those countries which are in fact less in need. So how, again, it comes back to this global debate of having some target which is universally applicable. But coming back to the question mainly which I wanted to raise, which is on volumes versus pollutant loads as a way of monitoring the target. Valentina, could I come back to you there, or
yes,
Graham after that, please?
Yes, I fully agree with you that the percentage is not a good indicator because, you know, in the past we have a very good examples, you know, when the volume discharged in river, you know, is used by agriculture, and this volume is used as an indicator for sustainable development. But in fact, the water quality is not controlled, and the agriculture using this water without, you know, evaluating the benefits. Water more controlled, you know, water use project when we can use this recycled water for water purposes, for example, for industry, can be much more valuable. You know, even for example, if you treat a part of the water stream to high quality for in industry, for example, we have such an example in Mexico, in using a small volume for the wastewater. After, of course, better treatment for industry, enables to pay operation and maintenance costs, because we can ask agriculture farmers to pay the full cost for wastewater reuse, because we need, it's very expensive this to construct the distribution network, and after that it depends on the topography, but to pay the pumping cost. So in a lot of countries we have financial incentives, you know, from municipality and so on, to cover almost all investment costs and to cover a part of operation and maintenance costs for agriculture. Well, in some cases, we can organize farmers to pay at least operation costs, but it's very difficult for agriculture, because I think that it's better to produce indicator evaluating the benefits, you know, the social, environment, the benefits for food security. For example, this is the case in California and Australia. So the municipality cover the investment cost, for example, but after that they calculate the annual benefits from this food production, local food production. And if it's Xavier here, I don't know, Graham, we need to discuss with this international organization how to include indicator pointing out the benefits for food production, for environment protection, for energy saving for industry, and you probably can propose us for industry. But the second group of indicators, from my point of view, are more valuable than the percent of volume, because we can include the water use in the frame of integrated water resource management and catchment scale on the urban area.
Thank you very much, Valentina. I'd just like to go to Graham, and then a few closing remarks from the other panelists, because I'm conscious of time before I just close our consultation.
Okay. Yeah, I think that, you know, the trouble is, if you pick a volume target, you're going to penalise against the people who, you know, are interested in recovery of nutrients, and if you pick a nutrient, you know, you're going to penalise the who against. So maybe the answer is to quantify the target in some terms of the percentage of recovery of the value of the wastewater for what it's worth locally. Because you see, in any given situation, it may be that they want to reuse that water because they want to use it to augment existing freshwater resources, or it may be because they want to recover the nutrients for improving agricultural productivity, or in the case of industrial wastewater, it may be that it's worth their interest to recover the energy component. So maybe we're better to look at this from an economic perspective and develop a target around the idea of the proportion of the value of that's recovered from the waste, and then that can be applicable across all different situations. I think this is the only way that you're going to come up with a good target that provides a good incentive for all the sectors, for agriculture, for industry, and for conserving, water used in domestic situations as well. So I think that, may I make, Jonathan, because I also I wanted to comment on the last point. It really is very much to support what my colleagues have said about this incredible need for capacity building, because I for one, and I'm sure my fellow panelists will agree, that we have some very good, some new, some existing technologies available to deal with wastewaters of all description. But there's no getting away from it, that there is a reticence, there is an unwillingness amongst some of the professionals in the sector to do things in the old ways. And I mean, we look very much to IWA here and your groups here that brings these things to the professionals. And I mean, I've been involved a lot in shallow sewage design, and I've tried all of my life to try and get the marvelous experience from Latin America to come to Africa on shallow sewage. And the main reason why it doesn't happen is that because you need the experts from Latin America, the engineers and the people who do the design work and the people who clear the sewers and run the sewers, to take the hands of their colleagues in the other countries and to show them that it's possible and it works in their situation, because it's no different actually in terms of the conditions. So, that's only going to happen if there's good capacity building, there's interregional capacity building, and that's something that groups like IWA can do very well, and us in the in the UN agencies and international organisations can support. But a lot of the uptake of these new approaches, the concept of decentralised wastewater treatment and all these things, are sadly missed out on by many of the countries, including
4, 7, 8, 8, 3, 4, 4.
To set new ideas, and the thing that people want to follow what they've always been taught at university and stuff like that. So I think that's a very important role. Anyway, I've taken too much of your time.
We lost the Jonathan.
Right.
Well, it seems that we have lost Jonathan, but we do have to wrap up anyway. So if I could just ask for a closing statement from everyone who's still on the call.
Jack, shall I give me 1 minute? Closing call, Job again here from the World Business Council. Just a quick, some shots. Volume versus loads. I think loads, volume, I think when I was listening to the discussion, I think perhaps we should integrate that more in the other targets around water resource management. I think water reuse could be woven into that piece, rather than specifically having it in these water quality, water reuse piece. Just on the drivers, technology, yes, but if you want to apply this into novel settings between industry and agriculture, etc., there may be novel partnerships and new business models, and regulators have to be involved. There's a lot more to do than technology, and ultimately just on the economics, on the values. I think it's a good point made about allocating the water where the economic value or the social value is the highest. It's very complex, and we are in the beginning of that story. So linking targets to something which is so in development as the field may be a little bit difficult. That's my final little comments.
Yeah, I was listening to Graham's proposition, and it certainly sounds like a good one for us to explore. But I must admit, my gut feeling was similar to yours, Job, in terms of is that going to be viable in terms of from an operational perspective? Sorry, I dropped out for a couple of seconds. Xavier, did you have some closing remarks, or did we already have some closing remarks from you while I was offline?
No, but I can just react to these last points raised in the discussion, because I think they are very important.
Thank you.
On the point of recovering value from wastewater, I think it's a brilliant idea. But in the end, we also need to go to quantify the volumes or the loads to be able to translate that to an economic value. So in the end, the complexity of measuring volumes, concentrations in wastewater, etc., will be there. It is a more comprehensive target, and I think it's nice, but it will be more complex. And then on the issue of volume versus loads, in the end, both are related, because loads are basically you need to multiply volumes by the concentration of the pollutants in these volumes to get the load. So in the end, again, we will need to go through getting information on volumes and the concentration of different pollutants in these waters to be able to calculate the load. So I think these are not antagonistic, but complementary. And basically, well, you were also mentioning before the issue of capacity building, essential point. I just would like to invite you to visit a UN Water project, which had the contribution of WHO, FAO, ICID, IMI, and others, and that was UNEP and others. And I think many of you should be somehow involved. It was coordinated by UN Water DPC, and it would be an interesting way to keep this discussion on capacity development for water reuse alive. So if you Google it, you'll find a lot of information on this project.
Many thanks.
Jonathan, we didn't talk about the terminology, and I would like to inform you that wastewater reuse is very negative terminology. Is killing the water use practices because it's raising the issue of negative impacts. It's not appropriate term, and it's not good to use, because to reuse water, we will apply everywhere adequate technology to reach, the standards of WHO to protect the public health. So wastewater reuse, it's our position. So we wrote a lot of papers, IWA group in California, Australia, they're using water recycling, and Singapore, new water, eco water. Really, even for the developing country, to use wastewater reuse is really very negative. It's very important for the development. So,
thank you. Yeah, I think FAO, your position is similar to that, I believe, isn't it?
Right. Yeah. Well. Yeah.
So we've heard that from various quarters, and I think that's. I think that's well-founded proposal. So I think given I'm informed that there's about 600 people who have been watching this, and I do realise that for some of you out there, it's quite difficult for us to cover all the your particular perspectives. And given the fact we've only had an hour, and unfortunately I dropped out for the first 20 minutes, it's not altogether satisfactory from your side, from the participant side, because you can't raise your hand, and it's quite difficult to field sort of a multitude of questions if they're coming in and feed them into a discussion, which is quite a compressed discussion. I hope we've managed to sort of bring to the attention both of ourselves and the wider community the issues that we're facing in relation to formulation of the target. It's clear that it's not simple, and we have a challenge on our hands to be able to encapsulate these challenges and formulate a target which, as we have highlighted, meets the political agenda, which but also has some some real traction on the ground. And we've highlighted that there is a need for that to fit in with the economic context. Let's see in the course of further discussion how we can actually introduce that. The consultation will go on online, and I am expecting probably quite a significant number of comments from you out there in relation to points that have been raised and points that haven't been addressed satisfactorily. And all I can say is that we will endeavour to take those on board and to respond to you. As I say, my name is Jonathan Parkinson from IWA, and you can contact me either through the website or contact me directly. I do know the Susanna Forum has a very active discussion going on around some of these issues. So those of you who are part of the Susanna network can use that network to discuss more. And we will confer more with the central organisation in relation to how we then make sure that we bring these together. And with my responsibility to confer with, to bring the main points to the attention of the UN Wastewater Task Force. And I would encourage you all to participate in the current theme, which is led by Aquafed. And there's some excellent contributions I see already for that discussion, which is really very much interlinked with the discussions we're having now. It focuses a little bit more on the collection of wastewater and less specifically on the reuse. But as a point has been raised that at the end of the day, we can't come up with too many indicators. And we have to be clever in the way we frame these indicators so that they meet these different needs. So I'm just going to thank, I think Robert first. Robert, who you won't have heard speak, Robert's in the background.